Shalom Aleichem. We are continuing in the 10th parak of Pesachim at Mishnah Gimel. Yesterday we talked about making Kiddush on Pesach Seder, and other Yom Tov. Same machloket Beis Shammai and Behillel applies. So now he's made Kiddush and he's sat down at the table. So Mishnah Gimel, Heviu lefonov, they bring it in front of him. And Mepharshim say we're talking about the appetizer course, the vegetable. Mitobel bechazeret. He can dip it with chazeret. So there's two things going on here. The first of all is the dipping that we do with our karpas, and the minhag is to dip into salt water to remind us of the tears of slavery. And it mentions chazeret here. Chazeret is one of the species which is allowed to be used as karpas. It is romaine lettuce. It's a lettuce that's, it's not terribly bitter. The stalks are a little bit bitter because actually the Mepharshim say it's good to start, if you got the message from something that's not so bitter, and we did tshuva and return to Hashem, it's easier than having something that's more bitter. But of course, the minhag is you could use whatever maror we use, but that's bitter. But you could also use chazeret for karpas, so it could do double duty. If you only have chazeret, you don't have anything else, you could use it for karpas and for maror. That's the chiddush here. So you dip that, and that has to last ad shemagia leparperet pat, until the eating of the bread. So you're not supposed to eat anything, and the bread in this case is the matzah. The pot here, bread, is matzah on the Pesach Seder. So it's only the karpas up until you get to the matzah. Normally for a Suda they would have other appetizers, other dips, but here it's just the karpas up until the matzah. Now the Mishnah continues, Lefanov matzah, they'd bring the matzah, v'chazeret, and here again the chazeret is the, being used for the maror. The charoset. Charoset is this dip. Shnei tavshilin, and two cooked foods. Now charoset is interesting. The Bartanura says this is the charoset we know and love, and he mentions it has dates in it, and peanuts, and almonds, and apples, and he adds in, they would put in chometz. They'd put a little bit of vinegar to make it sort of a little bit sour, and he also says in the Bartanura they would put in spices, and they would use like a kane of cinnamon, like a stick of cinnamon that was kind of mushed up into fibers. Why? Zecher lekash, as a remembrance, a reminder to the straw that was used to make the teats, to make the cement. Now, lema'aseh, I've never seen somebody put fibers of cinnamon stalk into their charoset, but the Bartanura apparently did so. And he says, tzarech shetiyeh ava zecher letit. The Bartanura concludes it has to be a thick charoset, not a runny, watery charoset, because it's zecher letit. It is in memory to the cement that was used by the Jews in slavery. Now the Shnei Tavshilin here, one is a Zecher LePesach and one is a Zecher LeChagiga. Nowadays we typically have an egg for the Zecher LeChagiga, and whatever meat is being served is a Zecher to Karban Pesach, but it's not identified as the Karban Pesach. We don't want anyone making mistakes. The Mishnah continues, Afal Pishen charoset mitzvah. Even though charoset is really not a mitzvah, we still have it together with things that are a mitzvah. The matzah and the maror, we're not worried about the taste of the charoset overwhelming the matzah and the maror. Those things are the ikr, and the charoset is just a dip. Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok Omer mitzvah, he says it is a mitzvah to use the charoset. The Bartanura says one reason is the tapuchim. It's not just a zecher to the cement, but the tapuchim, the apples, are a zecher that the Medrash explains. We had actually recently in the Gemara in the Daf Yomi in Sota, that under the apple tree, the Jewish women conceived and gave birth during the time of slavery so that the babies would escape being murdered by the Mitzrim. And the Mishnah concludes, "B'mikdash chay mevin lefonav gufo shel Pesach." If he's in the Mikdash in the time of the temple in Yerushalayim, so they weren't bringing two tavshilin, they were bringing two karbanos, a karban chagiga and a karban Pesach. The Mishnah Dalit, mazgu lo kos sheni, they mixed for him a second cup. They poured the second cup. V'kan ben shoel aviv, and now the son asks the father. The Bartanura says it should be v'chen ben shoel aviv, and therefore, because you're pouring a second cup, the son asks the father the famous ma nishtanah. The Mishnah says ve'im ein das beben. If the son is not so quick to notice the differeces and he's not asking by himself, avid melamdo, the father should point it out to him. Say, hey, look, we're pouring a second cup. Hey, look, we're dipping vegetables, we're reclining, we're doing things differently. You kind of point out the differences, and the kids pick up on this and say, well, why? So the Mishnah says, what do they say? Ma nishtanah halayla zeh mikolelot. Famously, ma nishtanah shebekol halelot anochlin chametzu matzah. Other nights we have chametzu matzah, halayla zeh kula matzah, and now only matzah. So we're trying to point out the differences and explain why these differences exist. Mishnah continues, Shebachol halilot anochlin sha'ar yarkot, halaleze maror. We have bitter vegetables. Shebachol halilot, other nights, anochlin basar tzli. Now, this is not in our Haggadah, Rabbi Sai, because we do not have tzli on Pesach Seder here in Golis without the temple, without our carbon Pesach being roasted tzli. The custom is not to have tzli, not to have roast on Pesach at the Pesach Seder. So just to finish up the sentence here, he's saying Shebecho anu chalin basar tzli shaluk umavushal. On other nights, we have any kind of meat we want. It could be roasted, it could be boiled, it could be cooked, it could be baked. Halayla zay kulot tzli. But here, everything's roasted. The carbon chagiga and the carbon Pesach were roasted in the time of the temple. Other times we dip one dip. Was customary to have dip. They famously had kuta chabavli sometimes. It was a milk-based dip. They had other dips. They had the hummus, tahina, of course. And this time we dip twice. We dip the karpas into the salt water. We dip the maror into the charoset. So we're pointing out the differences. Lafi daito shel ben, and according to the intelligence of the son, aviv malamdo. The father has to be sensitive to his madrega, to his level, and don't try to get too complicated and don't try to get too basic, but have an interesting discussion and point things out and have a back and forth. That's the idea. Is not that the balabas, the leader of the Pesach Seder, just preaches to everybody and says everything, but we want to have some form of discussion and questioning and exploration of the topic. And the Mishnah here concludes, Matchil bignut Messiah b'shevach. We begin with something which is degrading to mention to the Jewish people, and we end with the praises of Hashem for saving the Jewish people. It explains, V'dorsh ba'armi ovid avi. We begin with the Aramean trying to destroy my father, meaning Lavan, the Aramean, as the God explains, wanted to wipe out Yaakov Avinu. I actually heard an amazing parish that this is not just Yaakov, but Lavan and his father Betuel, they wanted to kill Eliezer Eved Avraham back in Chaye Sarah. And Eliezer was sent as the shaliach, as the agent, to get a wife for Yitzhak. And the problem is, we learned this in the Gemara, a few times we mentioned this, in Kedushin we mentioned this, if somebody sends a shaliach, an agent, empowered to marry someone for his son or himself, and then the agent, Nebuch, doesn't make it back. So the problem is, we assume the agent actually went and married a girl to him. So if they had murdered Eliezer, if Lavan and Betuel had succeeded in murdering Eliezer, then Yitzhak would not be able to get married. It would have been very hard for him to get married, because he would have to worry that any girl he marries, that Eliezer had already been Mekadosh for him, already married for him, that woman's mother or sister or daughter or something like this would be very hard for him to get married. So that's a deeper meaning to Arami Oved Avi, and of course we begin with the Genus. We say Avadim Hayinu the Parvim Mitzrayim. It was very bad, very downtrodden. And the Mishnah says Ad Yigmor Kol Parsha Kula, until you've explained all of the parsha. So which the Haggadah does. The Haggadah goes through the Psukim and explains the Psukim and brings later drashot of Chazal. When they had the famous Seder in Bnei Barak, explaining a lot of these Psukim. It's interesting to note that the first Pesach Seder ever in history didn't have all of those drashot. Of course, I'm sure it had drashot, but not all the drashot from Bnei Barak, because the first Pesach Seder in the world was conducted by Moshe Rabbeinu for his two sons, Gershom and Eliezer, who were not there. They weren't there at Kriyas Yamsuf and Yitzias Mitzrayim. They were the only two Jews who were not actually there at the time. So the first Pesach Seder was Moshe Rabbeinu explaining to his sons exactly what happened, which is actually, might be a reason why Moshe doesn't really get credit in the Haggadah, because the original Haggadah, the proto-Haggadah, that all of these were based on, was the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, who was Anav Mikol Adam, was very humble. He didn't want to insert himself so much into the Haggadah. So Baruch Hashem, our Pesach Seder will be continued tomorrow. Sei gesund.